International waters. What are they? How do they work? What is a naval blockade? How does it work? Legitimacy, illegitimacy. In these very delicate times, you hear just about everything. In this chaos, there's a risk of losing track of what's true and what's not, of what the rules and laws actually are. Here are the rules. The laws exist, and it's important to know what they say. And on that note, over the past days and weeks, we've worked with our collaborators, experts in international relations, international law, and geopolitical analysts to try to clarify, as neutrally as possible, at least the basics, the rules and the fundamental mechanisms behind the current geopolitical situation. The purpose of this video, let me tell you, is not to convince anyone to take one side or the other. Honestly, I'll tell you straight, we really don't care about that, about convincing people. Our goal is to provide information about an issue related to geopolitical sciences on a very sensitive topic to help us better understand some basic information that might help us form our own opinions later on. To understand the issue, let's take a few steps back. Let's start in 2009, 2 years after the political military organization Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. The State of Israel imposed a naval blockade on the Strip, a blockade that extends 20 nautical miles from the coast of the Strip. 20 nautical miles is about 37 kilometers. The Global Sumud Flotilla's goal was precisely to break this naval blockade, which many consider illegitimate, and soon we'll see why many consider it illegitimate, in order to guarantee a humanitarian maritime corridor to Gaza. So, what did Israel do at this point? As has happened with other naval expeditions in the past, on the evening of October 1st, it intercepted the flotilla about 70 miles from the coast of Gaza in international waters. And then it arrested the crews. At this point, among the many questions we're asking ourselves, there are two in particular. The first is the boarding of the Global Sumud Flotilla in international waters legitimate? And two, is the naval blockade on the Gaza Strip legitimate or not? A very brief answer. According to international law, the answer in both cases is no, it is not legitimate. Let's see why it isn't legitimate. Let's see what international law says. International waters. What are these international waters? Article 3 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as the Montego Bay Convention, approved in 1982, tells us this. Basically, up to 12 nautical miles from a country's coast, which is about 22.2 kilometers, the waters are territorial. That means they're considered part of that country's territory, so it can decide who can enter and what they can do. Beyond the 12 miles, you have international waters, which are not controlled by any state. The same UN convention, in Article 87, establishes the freedom of navigation in international waters, provided, of course, that the purposes are peaceful. In other words, no state can prevent me from sailing in international waters or interfere with what I'm doing. And this is where the first problem with boarding arises. The flotilla's vessels were about 70 miles from the coast, so in international waters, and they were carrying humanitarian aid. However, keep in mind, Israel did not accept the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and therefore, in theory, would not be obligated to comply with the contents of this international treaty. However, the fundamental laws contained within this particular agreement are an integral part of what is commonly called customary international law, which comprehensively includes all the unwritten rules of international law that have been consistently and uniformly observed by various states, to the significant point of becoming legally and formally binding. What does this mean? It means that even though Israel has not ratified the convention, it is still obligated to respect these laws. Okay, so Israel shouldn't have been able to block the flotilla so far from the coast. Is the issue settled then? Not exactly. There's the whole issue of the naval blockade, which is a real can of worms. Let's remember that the flotilla's stated goal was to break the naval blockade imposed by Israel on the Strip. In fact, the 1994 San Remo Manual, which specifically applies to armed conflicts at sea, states that a suspicious ship, suspected of violating a naval blockade, can be stopped, inspected, and seized. Careful, here's another piece of information. In 2011, the UN Secretary-General established an inquiry panel that recognized as legitimate the Israeli naval blockade to the extent that it was intended, and this is important, to prevent the arrival by sea of weapons destined for Gaza and intended for Hamas. In the case of the Global Sumud Flotilla, however, the goal was not to bring weapons, but humanitarian aid for the civilian population. And this is where the Geneva Conventions on the Protection of Civilians during armed conflicts come into play. The Fourth Convention, in particular, tells us clearly that the parties in conflict must always and under all circumstances guarantee the passage of essential humanitarian aid, like the aid carried by the flotilla. The San Remo Manual also states that a naval blockade is only legitimate insofar as it does not prevent the arrival of essential goods. Now, surely the voyage of the flotilla is a deeply political act. Let's be clear about that. Of course it's political, it's an act of civil disobedience, but the mission was openly non-violent, unarmed, and with peaceful aims. So, according to international humanitarian law, the flotilla was not violating the naval blockade because it cannot be applied to a mission like the Global Sumud Flotilla. Not only that, in 2024, the International Court of Justice imposed precautionary measures on Israel to ensure the delivery of food and medicine to the population of Gaza, in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, which explicitly prohibit using a naval blockade to starve or cause disease among the civilian population and therefore, in effect, as a tool to commit genocide. On this significant point, the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry recently issued a detailed report stating that Israel's actions in Gaza can be considered acts of genocide, but this truly opens up a much broader discussion, which we might address elsewhere at a later time. Now, another question. Is the blockade legitimate? There's the more fundamental issue of the legitimacy of the naval blockade. This is a tool provided for by the laws of war. As a country at war, I can impose a naval blockade on my own territorial waters. Israel has established the blockade on the waters of Gaza. Why? Because, as we know, it does not recognize Palestine as a state, so it considers those waters as its own. In fact, Palestine is a state with limited recognition. What does that mean? It means that not all other states recognize it. And here we enter a big gray area of international law. However, it must be said that from a strictly legal point of view, the territorial waters of Gaza cannot be considered Israeli. The International Court of Justice already stated in 2004 and again in 2024 that the annexation of Palestinian territories by Israel is illegitimate, since the Palestinian people have the right to self-determination. If Israel cannot consider Gaza as its own, it also cannot consider the sea in front of the Strip as its own, and therefore it could not even impose a naval blockade on those waters. That said, I know there will be all sorts of comments under this video. For us, making a video like this isn't advantageous. Absolutely not. It's not about views. We don't actually need views. We do it because we have an educational responsibility, and in recent weeks, so many of you have asked us to clarify things. Thank you for following.